Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our History of Revolutionary Ideas, we are going beyond 1848 and beyond Europe for another mid-19th century event, but this one on a completely different scale. Not because it was smaller, but because it was bigger. The Taiping Revolution in China, and our guide is going to be the historian of modern China, Julia Lovell, explaining the significance of a revolution that didn't just shape modern China, but shaped the history of the world. And it also illustrates another theme that we have talked about already in this podcast series, the revolutionary power of Christianity. Julia, I'm going to start with a big question. I don't know how easy or difficult this is to answer. The event that we're talking about is usually dated as beginning in 1850, right in the middle of the 19th century. Is it possible to characterize how China was governed in 1850, in the middle of the 19th century? How strong was the central authority, and what was the basis for its claim to govern the whole of China?
In 1850, China was ruled by the Qing dynasty. So they weren't an ethnically Han Chinese dynasty. They originated from a tribe of warriors, hunters, and traders from Manchuria in the northeast of what's now China. And they took over the old Ming Chinese Empire in 1644. So over the first 150 or so years, the Qing dynasty were spectacularly successful. They added to the old Ming Chinese Empire what's now Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and they gained political domination over Tibet. So this is roughly a doubling of the extent of the old Ming Empire that the Qing toppled in the middle of the 17th century. As a regime, as a governing culture, the Qing were political and cultural omnivores. So they absorbed this huge range of ideas and strategies to increase their power. So they were a multi-faith, a multilingual power. So emperors and elites were expected to have an outstanding grasp of Chinese literature, philosophy, strategies of governance, but also of Tibetan Buddhism, of Manchu and Mongolian traditions and disciplines of riding and shooting. Also, through the 18th century, the Qing dynasty grew very rich on trade. So actually, well into the 19th century, Qing China was one of the leading world manufacturers and exporters of luxury goods. So fast forwarding to the beginning of China's 19th century, the Qing Empire was one of the largest and most successful empires in the world. But between 1800 and 1850, circumstances acted against the Qing. So first, the population had grown enormously in the 18th century, which is very relevant to the outbreak of the Taiping War. So it at least doubled between 1650 and 1800 to reach 300 million. And this population boom, it squeezed land, work, and resources. Prices rose. Government was too small to function adequately. So all these issues generated a lot of popular discontent, local insurgencies, which the central government lacked the resources to suppress. The armies of the Qing, which had once been so successful, began to falter, to fall apart. And domestic insurgencies were very expensive to deal with, which led to a vicious circle of state impoverishment, insurgency, then more state impoverishment, trying to deal with the insurgency, and so on. But the greatest challenge that the Qing faced in the 19th century was the expansion of Europe, the United States, and later Japan. So in the early 1800s, Western countries sought new markets for their industrial products through free trade. And the huge empire of China under the Qing was an obvious target for these ambitious trading nations. And this ambition of Western nations, and then later in the 19th century, Japan, this became the stage, the setting for a series of ever-expanding wars that European empires and America, and later Japan, fought with Qing China through the 19th century, which began with the First Opium War in 1839. And so all these swirling crises, all these external threats and internal malfunctions, they were the backdrop to the Taiping Civil War.
As you say, the governing philosophy was eclectic. It was broad-ranging. Is it still possible to characterize it as fundamentally Confucian, or Neo-Confucian is a phrase that I've seen associated with it? Because one of the things we're going to discuss is what is the nature of the challenge that the Taiping uprising posed, and what was it they thought they were taking on? Did they think they were taking on a basically Confucian regime?
It's important to think of the Qing as a multilingual Central Asian empire rather than a purely Chinese one, even though the territories occupied by Han Chinese were probably economically most important to the Qing. So all key government documents were written in at least two languages, in Manchu and Chinese, and often in Mongolian and Tibetan. Also, the Qing imported some of its Manchu customs into China. So, for example, immediately after the founding of the dynasty in the middle of the 17th century, the population of the old Ming imperial China, they were forced on pain of death to adopt the hairstyle of their foreign conquerors. So these are the shaved forehead and long braid or queue. This became an emblem of Han Chinese submission to the Qing. But the Qing were at the same time anxious to prove themselves faithful inheritors of ancient Chinese statecraft. So they wanted to use Confucian ideas as a moral glue to hold together this country which they had subdued, they'd taken by violent conquest. And some of these Confucian ideas, which sometimes they're called Neo-Confucianism, some of these ideas had been used by governments of China since, well, before the Common Era. So, like Christianity, the key ideas of Confucius are multiply recast across millennia by different groups and individuals. So they're living, breathing things. But at least to governments and state builders, Confucianism was most often promoted as a philosophy of harmonious submission, of maintaining hierarchies. So governing Confucianism, if you like, was used to propagate the idea that if everyone performed their own social role properly in a kind of social political hierarchy, then the country would prosper. And at the top of this hierarchy sat the emperor, whose mandate to rule depended on him cultivating the values of Confucian scripture. So before the Common Era, imperial regimes had used the works attributed to Confucius and his disciples to promote these socio-political values. And Qing emperors were also given a Confucian education, so they were meant to promote in their own behavior and writings the philosophers' virtues of obedience, loyalty, hard work, and so on and so forth. And early on, the Qing reinstated the civil service examination. So these were tests based on knowledge of state-approved Confucian classics that arbitrated the paths to a government job and to wealth and social status. And during the Qing, these exams became the basic mechanism by which educated Chinese men were integrated into the Qing state.
And given the pressures that you described, population growth, economic pressures, the pressure of outside powers, was there a sense that that way of governing was coming under real strain? I mean, we're going to get onto the particular case of the man who is the leader of the rebellion, the revolution that we're going to be talking about, and the question of the examination system for the civil service effectively matters in that story. But more broadly, this ancient and durable tradition of harmony and hierarchy, was there a feeling that it was coming under real strain in a rapidly growing, changing, but also economically stressed environment?
I think the magnitude of the socio-economic and governance crises that were encroaching on the Qing Empire from the late 18th century, early 19th century onwards put a severe strain on the old Confucian playbooks of managing crises. I think, yeah, the magnitude of some of the issues and the crises felt quite unprecedented. But there is a new wild card element here for the Qing dynasty, which had not been faced by previous imperial regimes. And that is the impact of the growing influence of Western powers on the authority of the ruling dynasty. So I already talked about how Western powers, especially Britain and then France and the United States, were ambitious to increase trade with the Qing in the late 18th century, early 19th century, through almost any means necessary. So in the first decades of the 19th century, Britain balanced out a trade deficit with China, with the Qing, by importing huge quantities of Indian opium. The Qing tried to expunge this illegal narcotics trade in the late 1830s, and the British responded by sending a fleet to end the crackdown effectively. And that war was called the First Opium War. It was the first war between China and a Western country. And the military upshot of it is that the ships and guns, the modern firepower ships and guns of the British, secured victory against the Qing in 1842 in the Treaty of Nanjing. I think this war and later imperial wars during the 19th century had four big sets of consequences. The first was military. So the Qing army, which had up to that point really been the dominant military power in East Asia and Central Asia, the Qing army had been outgunned by the Europeans. Second, the consequences were economic. So after each defeat, Western powers and Japan extracted huge indemnities and often slices of territory from the Qing. And the consequences were political. So the Opium War and subsequent conflicts brought the Qing government into direct negotiation with European powers, the US and then Japan. And they used the new European concepts of international law to broker treaties that massively disadvantaged the Qing. So the broad process here is that these external conflicts that began in the 1830s eroded Qing sovereignty both internally and externally. And then the fourth set of consequences, which is also very relevant to the eruption of the Taiping War, there were a set of religious consequences. So since around 1800, Protestant missionaries had been trying but failing to gain access to Chinese communities outside the port of Guangzhou, which is where European traders were restricted to until the aftermath of the Opium War in 1842. The 1842 Treaty of Nanjing and subsequent copycat treaties signed with other Western powers strengthened the position not only of European traders and officials, but also the position of Christian missionaries, because the Treaty of Nanjing opened out to them more ports along China's coastline, and also, very significantly, French negotiators succeeded in cancelling a Qing imperial prohibition on Christianity that had been in effect since the early 18th century. So these consequences were critical to the Taiping War because its spiritual leader, Hong Xiuquan, developed his radical manifesto of rebellion against the Qing through an encounter with a Christian military tract.
So we should probably say a bit more about him and the particular version of Christianity that he ended up promoting. I notice you've been calling it the Taiping War. I think I called it an uprising. It traditionally gets called a rebellion. We're going to come on to the question of whether it's a revolution. It's probably all four of those things. And the last one we will come to later on. But let's talk a bit about the man himself, because some of this is very much a personal story. This vast rebellion, maybe even revolution, does begin with a moment of personal revelation. It is a direct personal encounter with Christianity that is the inspiration here. Can you tell us a little bit about the man himself?
Specifically, the First Opium War and the growing Western presence in the Qing Empire destabilized the south of China, where so much of the trade with Europe, with the West, was concentrated. And so not at all coincidentally, this is the part of China where the Taiping Civil War begins. So one ongoing element is that the defeat of the Qing in the Opium War utterly exposed Qing weakness, military weakness to people in South China. So you see local communities taking matters of defense into their own hands, forming armed bands, militias. And there's a very fine line here between self-defense and preservation of order and escalatingly aggressive vendettas and power struggles. You've got the disruption of economies in South China, so a lot of socio-economic immiseration, so a lot of old trade routes and also jobs are being shifted away from South China to the East Coast to Shanghai. So you're seeing a rise in local violence and desperation. And again, not at all coincidentally, it's these parts of South China which have been so disrupted by the European, the Western impact. It's these parts of China that become major recruiting grounds for the Taiping War. So you've got this context of growing internal insurgency. And it's worth pointing out that the Taiping Rebellion, the Taiping Civil War, is appalling in its human consequences and the intensity of its violence. But staggeringly, it is only the largest of the many regional rebellions that are kicking off through the 19th century in the Qing Empire. So that's the broad background. But the specific trigger to the Taiping Civil War is a man called Hong Xiuquan, who was born in 1814. He was from a fairly prosperous peasant family to the north of Guangzhou. He was a bright young man. He was coached intensively to take the fiercely competitive civil service exams, which were so key to wealth and success at that point in Chinese history. By the 19th century, these exams had become pretty much intolerably competitive due to population expansion. Some unfortunate men, if they could afford it, spent their entire lives taking, then failing these exams. So there's a story from the early 19th century of a 104-year-old failing one of these exams for the umpteenth time, but he was just awarded his degree out of sympathy, not because presumably he was going to get a civil service job. So Hong Xiuquan tried and failed to succeed in the exams in this pressure cooker environment. In 1836, he failed the exam in Guangzhou, South China, for the third time, and he seems to have had a complete physical and mental breakdown in response. So he takes to his bed in what seems to be a kind of psychotic, trance-like state. He has these utterly strange dreams that he'd gone to heaven, his internal organs were ripped out and replaced with new ones, he was purified and reborn. In one dream, an old man with a golden beard hands him a sword and tells him to exterminate demons and bring the world back to the true scriptures. And in another dream, Hong travels all over the cosmos, slaying evil spirits. And he's accompanied by another man, a middle-aged man, supposedly his elder brother. So eventually these hallucinations died down, but Hong still remembered them very clearly. So the kind of psychological mental process here is before these dreams, he's breaking down under feelings of utter worthlessness. But after the dreams, they've transformed him into a sense of total power and righteousness. Okay, fast forward 6 years later, in 1842, Hong failed the exams for the fourth and final time. Soon after that experience, he reread a Chinese translation of Christian doctrine by a Chinese convert that he'd been given just before his original breakdown. And at this point, his earlier dreams suddenly made sense to him. He realized that the man with the golden beard was the Christian God. The middle-aged man was Jesus. And Hong Xiuquan now identified himself as God's second Chinese son. And he decided that his mission was to convert China to Christian worship. So it's this realization that would generate over the next 2 decades the Taiping War, which lasted some 14 years and left 20 million dead and huge swathes of South and East China devastated.
That initial Christian impetus for this, as you say, he was familiar with the stuff before he had his initial breakdown, but something solidified for him later on. What emerged from that? Was it in any sense conventionally Christian? I have seen this compared to, I mean, it's a very, very different story, and I hesitate to make the comparison, but I have seen it made with the initial revelations that sparked Mormonism. An individual with a very direct experience of a kind of revelation, and from that emerging a new religion, ostensibly a Christian religion, but also something very new and distinctive. What emerged from this? Would it have been recognizable to those Western Christian missionaries as Christian, or does it look like a very distinctive Chinese hybrid?
Well, the backdrop here is that missionary Christianity was certainly on the rise in China after 1842. So second half of the 19th century, missionary Christianity boomed. For example, the Protestant missionary community moved from about 80 preachers to more than 3,000, 60 different missionary societies in China. Missions were founded for the first time all over the country, I think in around 14 provinces. So that's the backdrop that Christianity is becoming a social and religious force in China at this point. I think that the influence of Christianity did distinguish Hong Xiuquan's group, which began being called the God Worshippers and then became the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. So these ideas drawn from Christianity did distinguish Hong and his followers from other insurgencies going on in the Qing Empire at the time. It made them more radical, more militant, and iconoclastic. But Hong's interpretation of Christianity very much had its own local flavour. So his reading of Christian tracts was starkly puritanical, what we might call fundamentalist. He was very interested in the idea of an omnipotent God, about the degrading nature of sin and idolatry. It's a kind of Manichaean with a small m struggle. It's about mankind facing an absolute choice between salvation and damnation. And there were very traditional Chinese elements to his interpretation of Christianity. Hong's ideas about Christianity, his teachings about Christianity, tapped into what Chinese historians call millenarian belief in Chinese local culture. So for millennia, at times of economic, political, and social stress and crisis, the Chinese empire had been periodically rocked by desperate bands of rebels. And these rebels often rallied around the idea that achievement of a final peaceful world was just around the corner, that a messiah, often Buddhist, was about to appear to bring about a paradise on earth. But before this paradise could be achieved, a final apocalyptic battle between the forces of good and evil had to take place, after which the good would triumph and evil would be driven from the earth. So there would be a chosen few led by the earthly representatives of a celestial saviour would triumph in this struggle to found their own ideal community. So Hong's vision of Christianity was one version of this much older story. And it's easy to see how, to someone like Hong and other desperate people in South China, the disasters of the 1830s and 40s, the famines, the rise of violence, the defeat at the hands of the British implied that the old dynastic cycle was at a very low point. Hong's understanding of Christianity then was very partial, it was very personal. So he pared the 10 Commandments down to 6. He didn't really understand the idea of the Holy Spirit. First, he turned it into a holy wind, then he got rid of it altogether, and he took its place himself as God's second son. And at one point, he exchanges a correspondence with a London missionary who tries to suggest that God actually only had the one son, but you can see in this correspondence that Hong Xiuquan is using, he uses a kind of red pen, a red brush to strike that idea through to say, actually, there was one other son, that was me. If we're thinking, though, about Hong's Christianity within internal Christian self-referential context, I would say that Hong's Christianity is decidedly Old Testament. So there's an apocalyptic violence to his reading of scripture. So his reading is full of blazing vengeance that consumes all those who refuse to believe in Jesus. But Hong also imported what we might think of as loosely Confucian virtues into Christian scripture. So, for example, Hong's scripture emphasize social hierarchies, the importance of a correct relationship between ruler and subject, and so on.
And the idea of the heavenly kingdom itself, it was very much something that would be realized on earth. So this is not a version of Christianity in which the reward is deferred to an afterlife. This is, as you say, it's part of a tradition where, following the battle between good and evil, heaven will be here and now. That was what he was trying to create. Wasn't that a big part of the appeal of this, that the heavenly kingdom is accessible in the here and now. You just have to join the struggle.
Exactly. Yeah, the Taipings as an ideology in practice as well as in theory had a radical and often very authoritarian socioeconomic vision for transforming China. So they wanted to transform China morally, culturally, economically, and socially. And I think the fact that Christianity was an external foreign faith helped intensify or amplify the radicalism of their vision.
Can we say why it spread so fast? So as you say, this is by no means the only rebellion of its kind, but the scale of it so quickly outstrips the other ones. And yet, as you describe it and the origin of it, Hong himself and his ideas, it seems pretty, for want of a better word, eccentric. This is a very unusual story in its way, but something about it is a spark for which there is no comparable event, I think, anywhere in the world in the 19th century. I mean, there is nothing on this scale. The revolutions of 1848 in Europe are not on this scale. The geographical spread of it is remarkably quick. So something that starts in southern China ends up being centered in Nanjing very quickly. That is a long distance to travel. Is this evidence of the bankruptcy of the regime it was up against? As it was, something was going to do this. Something was going to catch fire and to rip through something that had become hollowed out. Or does it say something about the movement itself? It had a distinctive appeal. And was some of that appeal ethnic? Should we understand some of this to do with the ethnic makeup of the original uprising?
Going back to Hong's realization that his new mission was this quasi-Christian one, this revelation which takes place in the early 1840s. So Hong began seeking converts to his faith. So some of his first disciples were other men who failed the exams. Quite a lot of these early disciples were, like Hong, a member of an ethnic minority. So they're a member of the Hakka, which we could understand as a group of internal migrants in China. There was quite a lot of overlap with Han Chinese communities, but the Hakka also maintained customs distinct from the Han majority. And in their communities in South China, the Hakka tended to be marginalized geographically and economically. So this ethnic issue is very, very significant in 19th century. It's significant at the top of the governance of the Qing. So despite their spectacular successes between 1644 and the 18th century, the Qing themselves, being a conquering power from the northeast, an ethnically distinct conquering power from the northeast, they never lost an unease about security. They never lost an anxiety about themselves as a conquest minority ruling over a country that ethnically, demographically was dominated by the Han Chinese. And this ethnic conflict intensifies, well, it's always there in Qing history. It intensifies in the 19th century as you have the added stress factor of external invasion. So European powers vying for territory and influence in China. So a good example of this actually is the First Opium War. So in Chinese historiography of the 20th century, the Opium War is often portrayed as this awakening of a unified Chinese nation against foreign invaders. But if you actually look at a lot of the primary sources, both in Chinese and English, about the experience of the war on the ground in the 1830s and 1840s, it's very clear that the Qing Empire is in many ways at war with itself, at war internally, as much as it is at war with external invaders. So, for example, the Qing effort to fight the British is very often hampered, first of all, by ethnic conflicts. So conflicts between the ruling Qing elite and the Han majority at the grassroots. It's also hampered by interprovincial, sort of inter-home place divisions. So armies from one province, which is sent down to the south of China in order to fight the British, they end up fighting armies from that local place. So this is, as I say, a country at war with itself as well as at war with Britain and other European powers. The ethnic issue is very, very significant in the 19th century. So after Hong begins to gather recruits, he headed out of Guangdong, his native province. He headed into the neighbouring province of Guangxi to start preaching. In 1847, he and a group of charismatic recruits set up the Society of God Worshippers, and Hong began translating the Bible into Chinese in his own version. And then over the next 3 years, the movement grows dramatically. So by about 1850, Hong and his comrades had 20,000, perhaps 30,000 followers. And one of the key reasons why the movement grows so quickly is because this part of China, Guangdong, Guangxi, was a classic breeding ground for the kind of economic discontent and dislocation that is rife through the empire at this time. And Hong and his other God worshippers were preaching something simple and reassuring to the utterly desperate. So they promised a puritanical, egalitarian new society based on universal brotherhood and sisterhood among God's chosen children. Food, land, all resources were to be shared out together and equally. There's also an intense militancy to these new communities from the very start. So I think in many respects, the message that Hong was preaching and the way these communities were organized were a direct answer to the kind of existential threats to hacker survival posed by native Chinese secret societies and militias in South China. So the families or the occupational groups who joined Hong's God worshippers were bonded together into military units by this common religious belief to defend their interests against rival local groups. And this militancy just grew and grew through the 1840s and the 1850s. So early on, the early 1840s, I think Hong's vision is more a religious one. So the idea is to convert the empire to Christianity. But then it became increasingly anti-regime, anti-Qing. And so by 1850, which is the moment at which the so-called Taiping Heavenly Kingdom of Hong is declared to have been established, by that point, the Qing have been identified as the demons, as the enemies of this quasi-Christian group. And these Qing demons have to be destroyed, they have to be expunged so that Hong's paradise on earth can be achieved.
And how close did it come to achieving that goal? So it spread very quickly from 1850, when this becomes open conflict, through to 1853, when I believe the forces of the Heavenly Kingdom get quite close to Beijing. So that's that's a lot of the country now which is under the sway of this. How close did it come to overthrowing the Qing dynasty? How vulnerable in the end were their opponents?
Pretty close. Forgive me, I misspoke just now. I think that the Taiping Tianguo, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, was founded in 1851. So this gave the movement the name by which it's now remembered. And this was a really fearsome, fully militarized community. It could drill troops, it could manufacture weapons, it could direct battles and campaigns. And it had a badge of physical visual markers as well. So fighters in the Taiping, the male fighters in the Taiping, they abandoned the queues, the braids, the traditional hairstyle that showcased Chinese submission to Qing rule. They wore their long hair loose. So this is a highly disciplined, independent political, social, economic community obeying its own rules. And so over the next 2 years up to 1853, the Taiping forces really take South and East China by storm. The Qing armies, who are underfunded, badly organized, often led by incompetent generals. So the Qing armies were unable to stop the Taipings in these key early engagements. And every city that the Taiping took snowballed the movement. So every city they took fueled the movement with more resources. So, money and boats and weapons, huge stores of food. And a really significant milestone is the fall of the old southern capital, Nanjing, in 1853. So this is where the Opium War Treaty, the Treaty of Nanjing, had been signed in 1842. And the fall of Nanjing is just an awful event. So the Manchu population, so all men, women, and children were massacred. So I think it's really important to note the appalling, vengeful, racial violence of this conflict. But in addition to the Taipings, occupying the city was crucial strategically. So this gives the Taipings a really effective base from which to build their state. So Nanjing is where the Grand Canal starts, more or less. So it's where the grain from the fertile, damp southeast began travelling up the Grand Canal to Beijing, where you can't grow rice. So as a rebel or as an external invader, if you hold Nanjing, you basically hold the Qing Empire by its food pipe. And the Taipings ruled at Nanjing for 11 years until the city is again appallingly massacred at the end of the Taiping Civil War in 1864. And during this time, they're far more than in insurgency. So yes, they are trying to extend their military, their territorial control across China up to the north. So at one point between 1853 and 1855, they got as far as Tianjin, which is the port that served Beijing. But they're behaving like a state. They make their own weapons, they forge their own cannon, they issue their own laws and land deeds, they mint their own currency, they commission auspicious yellow silk imperial robes, not coincidentally, yellow silk brocade robes. That is the imperial style, that is the imperial colour. So they're truly ambitious to destroy the Qing and to establish their own dynasty. So they're not just a rabble of insurgents. They are an alternative political, moral, cultural, social, economic order.
And did acting as a state also include establishing new or different relationships with the Western powers? How did the Taiping, let's call it regime, think that it would coexist differently with the Western powers that had done so much damage to the Qing?
The Taiping, particularly through the Prime Minister, a man called Hong Rengan, who was a cousin of Hong Xiuquan, Hong Rengan, who's someone who'd actually studied with Western missionaries in Hong Kong and South China. So through this representative, in the early years, the Taiping were eager, I think, to establish new relationships with the Western powers, to portray themselves as the right regime, the right side to back in China at the time. But a series of frictions and conflicts and tensions stop Western powers from backing the Taiping. There's this growing uneasy sense that Hong Xiuquan's Christianity is not a Christianity that the missionary presence can recognize. And I think one of the key moments that prevents the Taipings from triumphing ultimately is the decision of Western powers after the Second Opium War finishes in 1860. So Western powers, after having pretty much wavered on which side to back for 10 years, having wavered on whether to get involved in this civil war at all. At that point, 1860, 1861, Western powers decide that they're going to back the Qing. They're going to help the Qing put down this insurgency. And I think it's by far not the only factor, maybe not even the major factor that enables the Qing to finally put an end to this insurgency in 1864. But it is an element, it is a cause.
And Hong himself, to what extent was this new regime still subject to his personal rule? Was he a kind of emperor within it? And as you say, it's part of its appeal is radical, egalitarian, social and economic promise, at least, if not the delivery of those policies, but the promise of a heavenly kingdom. And yet it's also deeply hierarchical, extremely violent. Where did he stand in it as it established itself briefly? But, 10 years is a long time. More than a decade is a long time. Where did he sit at the top of this hierarchical, egalitarian, radical new order?
I think even at the beginning of the movement in the second half of the 1840s, Hong's role is more as a charismatic, spiritual leader rather than as one of the leaders who's doing the practical work of turning followers into battle-hardened groups of fighters, drawing up strategy for besieging cities and so on and so forth, or even organizing the Taiping's radical socio-economic political blueprints for building a state. And that withdrawal from the front line of rational practicalities intensifies through the 1850s. So Hong becomes increasingly eccentric, increasingly detached from the day-to-day business of organizing a state. So he withdraws into his palace in Nanjing. He spends most of his time with his harem of women. This attitude to sex and gender is just one of the standout inconsistencies or contradictions within the regime. So the Taiping organization was in many ways extremely puritanical. So it enforced bans on opium smoking, prostitution, alcohol, gambling, and dancing. At one point, it tried to enforce total segregation of the sexes. So at one moment, sexual relations between even husband and wife carried the death penalty. But this attempt had to be abandoned after 1855 because first, it was bad for morale. And in any case, it was so clearly not observed by the top leadership who, like Hong Xiuquan, kept these enormous harems of women. So the regime itself, as personified by Hong Xiuquan's own style of leadership, it was built around this model of charismatic kingship. So absolute authority invested in leaders who styled themselves kings, who periodically passed into trances during which God would directly pass instructions on to them. And Hong Xiuquan's own behavior is probably the most extreme example or manifestation of this charismatic, trance-like approach to rulership.
Would it be fair to say, and this is true of many insurgent movements, that a tension emerged relatively quickly between the kind of philosophy and ethic that might motivate a relatively small group of fighters, of male fighters, ascetic, puritanical, disciplined, and so on? That's a good way to get a movement like this off the ground. But as a governing philosophy, when you are then suddenly finding yourselves in charge of a whole swathe of a diverse society, you're organizing an economy, you're organizing a system of education. If you're going to start telling husbands and wives that they can't have sex with each other, you've got a problem in describing how the future is going to work at all. Something that makes sense as the glue that would hold together a band of insurgent warriors starts to look really stretched when it becomes a way of governing a society. And that tension, it sounds like, over the course of the decade plus in which this regime existed, was laid bare.
Let's be very clear. The Taiping did have a serious and very radical set of social economic plans for China. They weren't just a kind of slash and burn exploitative insurgency. They had ideas for how they were going to build a new utopian community. And a really important idea was this idea of the Christian community as a huge family. Every member of the family was one of the children of God, equal before God. And this translated in practical terms into the Taipings trying to enforce equalization of resources, abolishing private ownership. And so all money was to be held in a common treasury, all land to be split up between families. Every 25 families were supposed to be supervised by a sergeant who governed over these small groups, would also have a religious function, holding Christian services every Sabbath. So there's this serious plan, this blueprint to eradicate all inequality, always a highly militarized society as well. So part of these community responsibilities were to take part in military drills and training. Harvests, in a foreshadowing of revolutionary Stalinism in the 1920s, harvests were to be returned to and then allocated by the state. And so it's not at all surprising, I guess, that the Chinese communists, after they came to power in 1949, acclaimed the Taiping as early proto-communists for things like the Taiping's plans for land reform, for collectivizing life, for organizing the population into collectives or communes, into these self-sufficient units, which were indoctrinated by officials, or in the case of the Taiping, by these sergeants. So the Taiping offered this really intensely radical challenge to the existing order. And so again, like the communists, I think the radicalism of this challenge drew from the fact that it was backed by a new and alien faith, a new and alien set of ideas. But going back to your question, I think it is doubtful how successful the Taipings were in actually spreading their new vision through the parts of Southeast China that fell under their control between 1853 and 1864. So I think the fact that these ideas initially found a following in China tells us a good deal about the sense of terminal misery prevalent in the country. So the Taipings drew a lot of their support in local communities from popular hatred for officials and landlords, just a sense of utter desperation. So the Taipings were able to draw to them a rabble of the desperate, but consistently they had difficulty in attracting large numbers of higher classes of society. So the higher classes, or even the middling sort, resented the Taiping's interference in economic and social life. Southeast China, which the Taipings took over and tried to govern after 1853, was, since the beginning of the Common Era, Southeast China had been one of the richest, most cultured parts of the empire. So this was the heartland of high, moneyed elite culture. And in the writings of these groups, talking about their experience of the Taiping, the Taipings are always a terrifying scourge. And also, it was just administratively hard to push these radical reforms out into the countryside. The Taiping leadership, they lacked personnel, they lacked time to do this. We need to remember that the Taipings were almost constantly fighting the Qing. And the Taipings themselves, they built this authoritarian, autocratic model with political power resting with theocratic leaders, with these heavenly kings who would issue their policy announcements after going into trances and receiving advice from God. And so through the 1850s, this model became very unstable. The movement was periodically torn apart by purges in the leadership, and Hong Xiuquan, the spiritual leader, became reclusive and highly unpredictable. And there were these hypocrisies and these inconsistencies about the puritanical theory of the movement versus the harems that the leadership themselves had access to.
As you describe it, it does seem like the term revolution is appropriate here. The scale of it, the ambition of it, the radical overturning, upending of an established order, and its replacement with, as you said, a seriously thought out, even if not ultimately successful, but many revolutions are not ultimately successful, a seriously thought out social governing philosophy. Yet it doesn't tend to be called a revolution. It gets called a rebellion. It gets called a civil war. And sometimes I think that's explained by the fact that it didn't succeed in overthrowing the established dynasty. The established dynasty, in the end, survived, came back, and fought back, and actually obliterated this movement. But that's true of 1848 as well. The 1848 revolutions did not succeed. The established dynasties, in many cases, survived. A difference that I've seen described between these two events that happened at roughly the same time, the Chinese one was on a far greater scale in every sense. Its geographical scale, the scale of the violence, the radicalism, the extent to which this was an upending of an established order. The difference is that the 1848 revolutions, though they failed, the ideas that lay behind them very quickly worked their way into the counter-revolutionary response, so that the counter-revolutionary response was an accommodation and in some ways a promotion of the thing that it was trying to suppress. So that you can trace from 1848 through the European century these ideas percolating through even as the initial revolutions themselves were snuffed out. In the case of Taiping, the snuffing out was complete. There wasn't an attempt to take account of what had happened and use it as the basis for a reimagining of what needed to be done, the kind of reforms that were needed. It was more like a civil war in the sense that when the retribution came, it was total. And it was only with the communist revolution that the idea that this had been the seeding of something that was going to come to fruition later became part of Chinese historiography. So I mean, I don't think this is a reason not to call it a revolution, but that is one of the differences here. The scale was greater, but also the reversal of fortune was greater when it ended. Do you think that's fair?
Well, for what it's worth, Marx saw the Taipings as a revolution, albeit not as a complex class stratified one, but rather as a blunt instrument which would destroy the old dynastic Chinese order. And since the Taipings, there's been this ongoing conversation or argument about what to call them. Are they a revolution? Are they a state? Is it the Taiping War or the Taiping Rebellion? The Qing always insisted on calling the Taipings a rebellion. And this was a clear rhetorical strategy to denigrate them as rebels, as troublemakers, as a rabble, rather than as a regime trying to build an alternative state. And then after the Taipings failed, after they were defeated, the term Taiping Rebellion stuck in the English language historiography until really quite recently. So yeah, that takes us back to this question: to what extent, I guess, in the modern era at least, does the criterion of success determine whether we call a movement revolutionary or not? So do all failed revolutions end up being called rebellions? But I listened back to some earlier episodes in this series, and I think near the start of the series, you suggested as a definition, a potentially working definition for revolutions, something that turns society upside down on its head, with those formerly at the bottom suddenly on the top. And I was greatly interested by the episode that you had on Christianity and how Christianity is the ultimate revolutionary doctrine. And again, I think it's no coincidence that the Taipings drew some of their most radical ideas. What sort of fueled the radicalism of the Taipings was Christianity. And I think they drew from Christianity this sense of the possibility of overturning hierarchies. But this definition of revolution as a total 180-degree reorganization of society, this definition does, I think, work for the Taipings. It helps us see the Taipings as a revolutionary movement, the way that some of the poorest, most dispossessed members of Qing society, these marginalized Hakka communities, the way that through the late 1840s and early 1850s, they just tore a swathe through the Qing establishment, through these once feared Qing armies, destroying the authority and often the lives of the rulers of provinces and cities, the way that they upended social, political, cultural elites, and the way that they didn't just have these military victories, but they also set up an ambitious rival state in a former imperial capital for 14 years. So this was a genuinely radical and relatively long-lasting reimagination of what China could be socially and economically. And again, I think it's really important to understand how important the foreign novelty of Hong's Christian doctrines were to the radical violence of the Taiping Rebellion. China had been rocked many times by peasant rebellions, but they typically failed due to an element of social conservatism. So, they tended to rise up wanting to restore a previous regime. So until the Taiping Rebellion, rebels against the Qing claimed they were struggling only to restore the Chinese Ming, so the dynasty defeated by the Qing in 1644. So this alien, non-Chinese quality of Christianity gave Hong's ideology an extra radical edge. So this really was a genuine challenge to the Qing and how the Qing wanted to organize its empire. But countering that, I would say that as the Taiping movement evolved politically, it didn't end up actually that different from imperial autocracy. Its rulers did end up working out of the old playbook of imperial power. They set themselves up as a rival dynasty. They made imperial robes and boots in yellow embroidered satin. This is the same sumptuary playbook as imperial dynasties and indeed the Qing. And the Qing did succeed in pretty much physically erasing the traces of this movement from China. So when the Qing retook Nanjing in 1864, some 100,000 Taipings in Nanjing were killed or committed suicide. And so if you visit Nanjing today, there is a museum to the Taiping movement, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. But it's a pretty small museum, I think, largely due to the practical reason that material remains are very scarce. So the relics left over from the Taiping barely fill one modest courtyard museum. I think this is testament to the thoroughness with which the Taipings were expunged by the servants of the Qing. But the ideas underpinning the Taipings did, as you say, have an afterlife with the Maoist revolutionary model of rural insurgency that gathered pace in the 1930s and that held sway over communist revolutionary orthodoxy until the 1970s. So to Mao, the Taipings were proto-revolutionaries. They were waging war against a stagnant feudal society, in Mao's view, which was, again, in Mao's view, holding the Chinese nation back from strength and modernity.
And it's also true that the Qing dynasty, it had half a century's life left in it, also comparable to some of the dynasties of Europe. They survived the 1848 revolution, but you can see that what was exposed was their ultimate underlying weakness. It did take another half century or more, but it's quite hard after this event. 50 years doesn't look like a long time when you reflect that this was the beginning of the end. It looks, I don't think it's just with hindsight that it does look, despite in a sense, the total victory of the counter-revolution, you can also see with hindsight, this was the beginning of the end. The weaknesses that had been exposed did not go away. And that was certainly true of the mid-19th century revolutions in Europe and what they exposed about the dynastic weaknesses of the regimes that they had been challenging.
You could say that. I think it's also, though, actually pretty remarkable that the Qing survive until 1911. And when they do collapse in 1911, it's actually quite substantially due to contingent events. So in historiography, there's been a rise in recognition in the last 10 or 20 years of what you might call a reflorescence, like a resurgence of the Qing from the 1860s onwards, which partly enables the Qing to suppress the Taipings in 1864, but also develops aspects of governance and economy that are very much a bridge to the incredibly successful modern China that we see today. Things like the development of a modern foreign policy system, foreign relations system, the embrace of international finance, so the development of Chinese banks, which enable the Qing government to raise loans not only to suppress the Taiping, but to take over other parts of their empire which are threatened by insurgency, especially the northwest in Xinjiang. So Xinjiang as a part of the PRC today, would not exist, I think, as a part of the PRC today had it not been for that resurgence by the Qing, the recovery of the northwest at the end of the 19th century. And so I think the Qing's ability to suppress the Taiping and hold on until 1911 shows actually the power and vitality of reform relative to the absolute radicalism of revolution at this point in Chinese history. So it shows that the Qing Empire can reform, that it's not dead yet. So the key innovation that enables the Qing to suppress the Taipings is a absolute overhaul of its military system. So the Taipings originally succeeded so dramatically because the huge Qing standing army was badly trained. It was underinvested in defending particular places. So bits of the army would be moved from one distant part of the empire to another part of the empire. And as a result, they were just not committed to defending the places they were sent to fight. But the threat of the Taipings forced the Qing military machine to generate an entirely new form of military organization. So these were provincial armies, which were run by powerful local gentry figures who took charge of local taxation revenue to maintain these forces. So, out of these new models came a new professional sort of army with a deeply vested interest in local defense. These new local forces were given Western arms and training, and these were the forces that shut down Taiping control over key cities in the southeast. And they're really the foundation of the modern and modernizing Chinese armies of the 20th century.
A reminder that if you would like to hear the bonus episode, part 3 of my conversation with Chris Clark about 1848, that one is now available on PPF Plus. It is a year since we started PPF Plus, so that means if you sign up now, there's a year's worth of bonus episodes waiting for you there, 24 bonus episodes for all of our series, on political films, on political fictions, on everything. Waiting for you, £5 a month or £50 for the year. There's also a new edition of our free fortnightly newsletter, available tomorrow. In that one, I'm going to be writing about the event I'm doing this weekend with Robert Saunders at the Bath Curious Minds Festival. We're going to be talking about Churchill, and I'm going to be writing about the significance of Churchill anniversaries in 2025. Plus, there'll be all the usual links to our most recent episodes. Coming up on the history of revolutionary ideas, we're moving from politics to science. But science is never far from politics, and that's certainly true in this case. I'm going to be talking to Adam Rutherford about Charles Darwin and how he revolutionized our world. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.